I'm Tony Ruiz of Gold Derby here with the creative team behind the PBS miniseries, The American Buffalo, director and executive producer Ken Burns and writer Dayton Duncan. And Ken, this could have been called so many things because after watching it, this is not so much about the American Buffalo. It's about the American Buffalo as kind of like a symbol of America at both its best and its worst. Isn't that right?
That's exactly right. I think that's true of so many of the films that we've done, particularly biographies, and we consider this a biography of an animal, that in order for it to be firing on all cylinders, you've got to be realizing that you have to understand the age in which that person or that thing exists and the way in which the age was influenced by that person, and in turn, the age influenced it. And so the buffalo, something we've been thinking about for years and years and years, 30 years about doing. Finally, I think to our great fortune, we didn't do it right away, as we often jump into something. And we were able to benefit from new scholarship, from Native American perspectives that would have probably been given more, I won't say lip service, but would have had less a centrality than they had before. And what you end up is a story of us. Really complicated, really dark. And as Dayton says in the intro, that it's a tale of utter destruction. But if you go a little bit farther down that trail, it gives you hope. And I think for us, it's just a classic American story in which you never realize the extent. This is the greatest slaughter of wildlife, mostly the buffalo, but also including elk and grizzlies and wolves and coyotes in the history of the world. And it's on us, on our watch. And at the same time, we are exterminating the Indians or moving them onto reservations. And, as we have a scene in the second episode, we put them both on a coin, on the nickel, because the sculptor said he wanted to make a coin that was unmistakable for any other country's coin. And so here you have these two entities that we have spent the last century trying to get rid of, now emblematic of us. And as the George Horsecapture Jr. says in our film, do you have to kill the thing you love? This is a really good question for Americans always.
Well, and Dayton, this is such a, I look at the totality of kind of how these types of films work, and I'm curious where your process begins. Do you approach this differently than, say, like you would approach if you were writing a book or something like that? Because it is such a unique form to write for.
Well, I write nonfiction books as well, and I consider myself a writer first, and then with Ken's help became a producer of documentaries as well. And so for me, the process is basically the same of when I was just writing a book. We do end up also producing a companion book, which has a lot of the information that, couldn't be squeezed into 2 2-hour episodes. But it begins, you want to shed yourself of any preconceptions that you already know what the story is. You want to discover it, let it speak to you. And you do that by reading as much as you can about it, by going to the places that are involved with the films, and there get a better sense of what took place, of meeting people from those places and talking with them and discovering, as we always do in all of our films, including this one, people that we wouldn't necessarily encounter if we were just doing all of this by reading books and looking at, authors, but finding people who can help us bring this story to life. And I think, as Ken mentioned, particularly with the Native American folks, there are a number of those people that we met in making this film in the early going, before I wrote a script, who could bring the devastation of the slaughter of the buffalo in much better terms than the best prose I could ever write, and make you feel it, make you understand it, make you also feel the connection that many tribes had with this species that they co-evolved with for 12,000 years before they were brought to the brink of extinction in the case of the buffalo, and also driven down to their lowest number of human beings on our continent as well. So it's a little bit the same, but I think what I learned with Ken is to hold back the rush to try to get it out there and to let it tell you, you know, what are the touch points, what are the most important moments, and what are the themes that you want to make sure are always present as you are always struggling just to tell a good story.
I also think one of the things that I love about this film so much is there are so many moments where there's a kind of a repeated motif that I noticed immediately in the very beginning of the film, and either one of you can speak to this, but there's that still photograph of the stack of buffalo skulls, and it reminded me eerily of like going to the U.S. Holocaust Museum and seeing like all of the the hair and the shoes and the suitcases, and I was like, wow, that this in many ways was an extermination. Is that a fair parallel to make?
Totally, totally. I mean, I think we feel that, and it's part of, as Dayton said, this process of discovery in which you want to hold off having any kind of definitive thing to impose because the material itself is going to speak. So with regard to the Native American speakers, many of them scholars themselves, they're able to represent their 600 generations of experience, which is, no matter what you say, a hell of a lot more complex than the 6 or 7 or 8 generations that we Americans can sort of bring to the picture. Yes, it is that, and that's a terrifying thing. And as said in the film by Dayton and others, these are two competing visions of how you own land. We say own my land. Native peoples are into stewardship. We are into conquering nature. Every step we're taking is conquering the continent and cutting down the tree and killing the animal, and not sort of finding some relationship of peaceful coexistence with it. And so you have these two incredibly impossible to reconcile points of view about everything. And yet somehow out of this horrific extermination, as you talk, also comes something's born of it. A conservation movement is born of it, in part. A need to preserve not just animals, but the places where they are. And so we've always talked about it. Dayton said this first, that the 2 episodes of a film are the first 2 acts of a 3-act play. And that now is being written by us. And I don't think we've ever had a film. We brought films up to the present, but we've never really said there was an actionable aspect to this. That is, like, we're throwing back on the audience, what will you do, right? How will you be part of the solution, or you stand by and be a neutral, which is basically part of the problem, or will you continue to be part of the problem? And we've spent a lot of time together, Dayton and I, in the American West, and dealing with the history of the West, or dealing with the Lewis and Clark journey, or dealing with a funny story of the first cross-country automobile trip, the Dust Bowl, and this one sort of in some ways tied a lot of that up, even though it's not as big as the West or the National Parks series that we did. It really began to tie things in a way that we could understand the whole arc of us. And the Native American dimension was central because of the fact that the buffalo was in their consciousness, in their spirits for that entire 10,000, 12,000 years that Dayton said, that their creation myths, that every part of their everyday life, their subsistence, is dependent on this animal, and they have an interdependency that we could just stand back and permit to be the sort of central boulevard of the film, and then everything else. But it's true. We're dealing, which is, we're dealing with a mass extinction event, which just comes this close. And I mean, one of the great ironies is that when we finally set aside a wildlife refuge, where do we get the seed stock for that refuge? The Bronx Zoo. And we have to ship buffalo from the largest city in North America to out west to the homelands of the Kiowas who've been displaced from this place where their creation myth begins in order to put animals back into the wildlife and hope that they'll grow, which they did. And it's, you can't make this up. This is why people keep saying, when are you going to go to Hollywood? I said, why? None of the stories Hollywood takes our stories and then always sort of bends them to some other preconceptions of how it should be, when the real story is so complicated and so dynamic.
Yeah, I think that Ken mentioned that in all the films that we make, we always come across a moment in history or a story that is so much more powerful because it's true, but is also just so improbable and unlikely. And we always look at each other, you can't make this shit up.
Right.
And for me, one of those epiphanies was in the research, connecting this thing that the first national effort, when we're trying to pull us or demonstrate how we came that close to extinguishing this magnificent animal, but then this motley group of people, for their own bizarre sometimes, but often contradictory reasons, decide, no, we're not going to let that happen. I'm going to try to do what I can to save it. And as those tumblers start to connect, this unlikely migration of buffalo by train from the Bronx Zoo to the Wichita Mountains occurs. And in the research of understanding in the myths and stories of the Kiowas and certain bands of Cheyenne as well, they believed that the Wichita Mountains, particularly the most prominent one, which we call Mount Scott, was the place where buffalo emerged in the first place, before human beings. But it was also the place where, if the covenant between human beings and the buffalo were broken by their beliefs, they would disappear for a while and withhold themselves instead of giving themselves to the tribes. And when they did that, they went back to where they came from and waited until they could be persuaded that we learned our lesson as human beings, we're ready to start it over again, and then they'd come out. And of all the places where this would get its start again on a national level was in the foothills of the Wichita Mountains, within sight of Mount Scott, in the presence of Comanche and Kiowa Indians, some of whom remembered the time which was extinguished when buffalo were everywhere, as well as little Native American children who had never seen a living buffalo in their lives. And to me, that moment, it was, in one sense, the climax of the emotional climax of the whole story. I mean, it continues because there more need to be made, and there are very interesting stories about that. And to allude, as Ken mentioned, to this Act 3, that there's more of this going on now on native reservations, which is very exciting stuff. But that convergence of location, the sacred place, became even more sanctified, when these 15 buffalo were released and, started mating, and
you can't make this shit up.
More. Yeah.
I made one little adjustment to, I was so flabbergasted, so gobsmacked by this moment, that I made one little adjustment to the script when Dayton had said they were in their new home. And I said, new old home, because you just wow. Nobody, no screenwriter in Hollywood would have the chutzpah to tell that story that way. They'd be laughed at.
And can I just add one thing about what we talked about earlier about the importance to us of the native people who helped us make this film? That moment is solidified when you're listening to Tantu Cardinal reading the words of Old Lady Horse talking about their disappearance, the last buffalo herd going toward Mount Scott, it opening up where the rivers flowed clean, not bloody. There was green, foliage everywhere. And that's where they returned. And it's such a powerful, uh, written account, made so much more powerful by her reading, and then capped off by the great, now late, Scott Momaday, the Kiowa poet, who's imagining Old Lady Horse being there and what it would have meant to her and what it means to all Native people. As he says at the end of that exquisite interview section, it makes the story whole.
Yeah.
That's where they went to disappear and wait, and here they come back.
Well, you both touched on this, and it was the thing that as an English teacher I'm consistently drawn towards, is this idea of juxtaposition of two things existing in almost opposing ideas existing in the same space. You talk about them returning to where they were, where they originally were taken from. Charlie Goodnight, that photograph at the end with Charlie Goodnight and the tribal members, some of these conservationists also being, eugenicists as well. Yeah. And so what do you think that juxtaposition, that constant juxtaposition that exists in this film, that can't be lost on you? What is it about this story that brings that out? Why is that juxtaposition such a part of who we are as a nation?
Well, it's who we are as a nation, whatever the subject is. It's always true that there's always complexity. There's always undertow. There's nothing simple and binary. The people that are good aren't completely good, and the people who are bad aren't completely bad. And so good storytelling is able to transcend a dialectic of an argument of you're right, I'm wrong, I'm right, you're wrong, whatever it might be. And so the stories that we've have told over the decades have been about this kind of give and take, in which you understand, I'm working on a history of the American Revolution. May I tell you that George Washington is unbelievably complicated. We don't have a country without him. And this guy is also a slaveholder. And when he wins, he says, okay, now you go, that regiment go, and you round up all the black people and send them back to their back to their plantations, and they're going back to work. I mean, and that's just one little tiny contradiction. And, this is the guy who's opaque, who doesn't show much of his emotions, and rides into battle 4 or 5 times where people are going. I mean, one aide says, I put my hands over my eyes because I didn't want to see him shot, in like improbable things. Dwight Eisenhower did not go and land at D-Day, right? He's in London. I mean, this was an amazing story. And so we find that everywhere. And that's really important to tell, because I think, as you know, from English, that from literature, that the tendency is to take our past and shape it into a one thing or another thing, as if it's some battle, when in fact it's so complex and so rich that it reminds you of the beauty and complexity of human beings themselves, all of us, you, me, Dayton, everybody. And that if you respect and honor that, then you have a narrative that people respond to. And I don't think it's an accident why our films are hugely popular. We may be good filmmakers, but what we're telling are stories that remind people of the complexity of themselves and the people around them that they love, And if you're a black and white person, my way or the highway, you can't be married. You can't have children. You can't go to Thanksgiving. You can't have a conversation with your neighbors. You can't be in society. And we all are. So somewhere along the line, we've already acknowledged deep down in early on that it's not all one thing. And that placid pool has some undertow to it. That, to me, is the essence of what a story is able to do.
Yeah, and yet, no, go ahead, Dave.
It's not just truth. I was going to say it's important to us, our understanding of history to only understand it, but to portray it, to be honest, to see the past, warts and all, so that it's not some glorified distant thing or some disgraced distant thing, that it is human beings like we are today making decisions for a variety of reasons, some better than others. That's truthful history. I would say, as a writer, all great literature also understands that. That is good storytelling.
Yeah.
That's the Greeks taught us this, great Russian novelists taught us this, great American writers like Mark Twain tried to teach us this. So it operates, both impulses are heading you down the right way. And also it allows you not to try to be didactic
Right.
or preachy.
Yeah.
But hopefully, if there is preaching, if there's a sermon in it, that you understand it without being pointed, a finger being pointed at it to say, and this is the point here.
Yeah.
It emerges from the story, and that's what good storytelling does.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, I feel like films like this are more important than ever because they are complex, as opposed to what some forces want to impose, which is like this, for lack of a better term, whitewashed version of history that holds our country up as like a shining beacon on a hill, when the truth
It's more complicated, more
is
interesting.
complicated than that.
Yeah, and much more interesting. It gets sort of tired when you have the sort of Soviet style of history, right? Where it's just like, this guy's now in, so all of our history revolves around him. This guy's now out, so he doesn't exist. He's cut out of the pictures. And now this tendency that you want to save people from what? Our world is really violent, is really difficult. Coaches are yelling at you by the time you're 5 or 6. Somehow in 5th or 8th grade, you can't hear something bad about your history without it being it. What it is just it's old white supremacy coming back in a new form, sort of saying we, pay no attention to all of that other stuff that's happened. I'm making a film also on the history of Reconstruction, and after the beginning of the migration of African Americans out after the collapse of Reconstruction up to the North, the Ku Klux Klan had another job, which was to round up people who were leaving, because all of a sudden it was like, what? You're going? But who will then pick the cotton? Who will then do this menial job? Who will do this? And so you pick up the paper today and find out we're going to deport 11 million immigrants, and then see if you can get your bed made at a hotel, right? And see if you can have your, toilet cleaned. The real stuff is so interesting, and it doesn't diminish in any way the carpet by sweeping out some of the dirt and saying, why hide this? This is true. As Dayton said, this is just true. We're not making stuff up. We're not putting a thumb, we're swinging in revisionism to some despairing view of America. We've always exalted this story. At the same time, we can't exalt it unless we acknowledge aspects of it that are less exalted. And then you put these things in relief and you see, as Lincoln would say, where your better angels are.
Yeah, I think the thing you need to know about Ken and myself is one of the things that drew us together as friends so many years ago is both this belief in narrative storytelling, but also an abiding belief and admiration for the words that radical words that created our nation, that all human beings are created equal and they have certain inalienable rights. And those are we are unabashedly deep believers in that was a radical view. It's a great view, and it's a worthy goal. And that's what our nation, this journey should be. And in order to reach that, you gotta come to grips with the times that we've, stumbled and, tripped and sometimes retreated from it. And one of the things I like about this story as well, besides it's about as tragic a story as I know,
right? But
at the same time, it also has the seeds of inspiration in it that common people, some famous, but many of them more common than not, individually starting these efforts to save this magnificent species from becoming just a memory, and finally it growing, and in a democracy, finally getting the federal government to do what it refused to do 100 years or more earlier, which was, we don't care if they're gone. In fact, some people thought that'd be the best thing for us, is to get the buffalo gone, and then we can help us subjugate the native people. But they came together and finally got the government to do the opposite, which is to protect them, not only protect them, but then try to encourage their increase. I mean, that's a
Good story.
glorious story in its own right, but it's only glorious if you spend some time talking about the mistakes along the way and
Yeah.
face up to them and
It's
what caused.
It's like landing on the moon. You think that the first time they went there, it all worked out. First time they sent a rocket up in the air, it all worked out. I think the story is made interesting by all those launch pad failures and all the stuff and the improvisation that takes astronauts that should be dead back home alive. I mean, that's the good stuff. I am sorry, you guys should continue talking, but I gotta dive into the editing room for the rest of the day.
Well, our time's up anyway, and I'm so grateful to both of you. Everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the upcoming award season, and stay tuned for interviews with more contenders in the coming weeks. Ken Burns, Dayton Duncan, a really great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.